Oh,
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the August 2017 edition of Consciousness Hour. We've had some very interesting guests over recent months, and we've very much been zooming in onto the parapsychological aspects of psychic phenomena. We've also been discussing elements such as dimethyltryptamine and alternate realities. But it is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Dr. Eric Ouellet. Eric, is that how I pronounce it? Is it Ouellet?
It's Ouelett.
Ouellet. Okay, Dr. Eric Ouellet. My French is non-existent, by the way, so it's one of those things, really. But he's Professor of Defence Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada and at the Canadian Forces College. He has a Ph.D. in sociology from York University, and he's the liaison officer for Canada with the Parapsychological Association. He's published parapsychological work in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology, EdgeScience, and the Bulletin Métapsychique. His other research works focus on military sociology and war studies. Now, I came across Eric's book a few years ago now, Illuminations, the UFO Experience as a Parapsychological Event. And the book spoke to me personally because I'm a trained sociologist like Eric. And I've always been very, very keen to apply sociological aspects to the UFO phenomena. Now, the UFO phenomena is something I haven't actually written about in the past, except in passing. But my new book, The View from Begonia, is going to be an approach whereby I'm going to be taking the aspects of my previous book, Opening the Doors of Perception, and expanding it out into looking into exactly what is taking place when people are abducted, are there links to DMT events, how can it be linked to such things as lucid dreaming and various other aspects. And these are very much areas that Eric looks into as well in his absolutely incredible book. And I mean, I strongly advise people not just to read Eric's book, but to read his blog page as well, because there's some fascinating material on there. I mean, I was particularly fascinated by your research into the Marian effects in Upper Egypt from many, many years ago, and I thought that analysis was fascinating in the extreme. Because from my background, I focused in on the sociology of religion. So, I'm very much interested in the idea of how ideas, religious ideas, and these type of things actually become inculcated into us sociologically. So, without further ado, Eric, if you can tell us a little bit about somebody from your background, how you ended up studying the UFO phenomenon. What was it that drew you to it as an academic?
Well, it was I would say, a journey. Started when I was actually young. I witnessed a UFO observation. It's kind of a bit strange to say that, but my older brothers were seeing something in the sky. They were all excited. They had the binoculars. And I was younger and tried to bug them to see something. And eventually they gave me the binocular, but by that time the UFO was gone. So it kind of had an impact on me that there's the UFO event and there's the people who were observing the UFO event. It was kind of two different things. After that, not much happened until I would say around 1995, where I met a friend who was very much involved in UFO while I was doing my Ph.D. And I got really interested in the topic. And so as I read, though, I became also disappointed. It was the days of where a lot of people were seeing conspiracy theories everywhere. And so that was kind of really disappointing. So I decided, you know what, how about I take this as a normal academic research and do the usual stuff. So I did a survey of the literature, looking at, what's good, what's not so good, and tried to find out where are the gaps and what are the main hypotheses. And that's how I started to develop my blog, which I wrote for several years, but taking a break now, but I will resume soon. And then out of the blog, the best material, I transformed that into the book, that Illumination you just talked about.
I see. So from a sociological point of view, what do you think is taking place here? I know you reference one of my favorite writers, Durkheim, and particularly Durkheim's concept of the collective consciousness. So where do you approach it from? So if you can give us a little bit of background of how sociology can be applied to a phenomenon that is both external to us and seemingly internal as well.
Well, I picked the UFO phenomenon because it is usually or oftentimes a large-scale one, so it involves a lot of people. And most of the explanations I found were, as you prefaced earlier, either based on psychology or technology, but not really no one looking at it from a sociological perspective while accepting that maybe something genuine happened, whatever is that thing. So that's where I started. And then I got interested in parapsychology, which again is based on the individual, because most of the people in that field are from psychology. And I started to draw some inferences that if psi phenomena, so the phenomena that are described by parapsychologists, are emerging from deep inside the unconscious of individuals, why could it be possible that we have large-scale social psi events that are emerging from our collective shared unconscious, which I call the social unconscious, and it's kind of a bit of a parallel between the individual consciousness and the individual unconscious, and there is the social consciousness as described by Durkheim and his successors, and there will be a social unconscious of shared feelings, views that are deeply ingrained among us that may be the source of a social psi event. So that's where I got involved in this.
So in terms of this, I'm getting echoes very much of Jung and the collective unconscious and the idea of some kind of collective egregore of consciousness, that somehow we share certain things. And what do you think the tool or what facilitates such contact? Because effectively it's non-local, isn't it? In terms of in normal science, in the sense of scientism and in terms of materialist reductionism, my consciousness, whatever that is locked inside my skull, and whatever goes on in my head cannot be influenced by anything that's going on in anybody else's head, except through direct communication in one way or another, through language or whatever. So how do you feel that the mechanism by which this works and upwells from somewhere?
Okay, that's a very good question, by the way. There's two mechanisms. One is I would call normal. It means that yes, what's happening in our head is happening in each of our own head, but our head is filled with all kinds of things that are coming from society. So rules of good manners, language, culture, key points of reference. I mean, the list is almost infinite. So we are actually shared things, and we're not even aware that we're sharing things. But without those shared common values, norms, reference points, we will not have society. So that's one aspect of it. So if we see an event, a lot of us will have the exact same reactions because we share those values, norms that we've learned through our life, and especially when we're young. So that's the normal mechanism. But there's reasons to think that there's also less normal mechanism, whether it be some sort of shared telepathic consciousness or something that goes beyond the normal set, because it's surprising that some people who have ideas, perspective, that have had no contact with each other and are exactly the same. So it points towards something called telepathy, and it might be in some cases more shared than we think. There's some research early 20th century about the study of crowds, and some very careful observers noted that the crowd seems to move or do things as if someone was giving a command, and it almost requires some sort of non-normal means so that the feelings are shared across the crowd. So there's no hard proof yet, but there's a lot of strong elements that point in that direction.
Yeah, because it's very much the concept of the third man, isn't it? You know, the idea of there seems to be an additional something that comes about whenever people group together, and effectively, and I think as you said in one of your postings, you know, you have the relationship between two people, but as soon as you bring in a third person, the complexities of the relationships and the interpretations can be broader, and it's almost as if groups of people can generate something that is greater than the collection within the group, you know. And the social psychology of crowds has shown this many times, isn't it? The research has shown that there seems to be, as the term I used specifically before, an egregore as if there's something else that is creating. It's almost like Borg consciousness, isn't it? You know, the idea of some kind of collective, almost going back to a tribal nature. Now, effectively, in terms of this, your analysis on your website, I thought was particularly interesting from many years ago, where you were describing a series of events that took place in Upper Egypt, where somebody saw the Virgin Mary above a Coptic church. And I thought your analysis of that was quite fascinating. Would you, because I'd love you to talk a little bit more about this, and we'll get more into your latest hypotheses. But I was very interested in your take on that particular event. And for those individuals out there who've not heard of this event, it is quite fascinating sociologically and in terms of social psychology in crowds, I think. So if you could expand a little bit, I'd be really interested.
Yes, well, these are events that happened in the late 60s in Egypt, in a small neighborhood outside Cairo. It's called El Zaytoun, and there's a Christian Coptic church in a Muslim country, and some people walking in the street saw a lady on the roof of the church, at the top of the church. And it's interesting that from the get-go, there was a group of Christian women who readily identified the lady as the Virgin Mary. But there is also a group of Muslim bus drivers and mechanics of the bus depot, which was just across the street, who saw a lady who thought was about to commit suicide, so jump from the roof. And so that's an interesting element of the story, is that from the get-go, you had people who, believers and non-believers in Christianity, who actually saw something. So there's a degree of objectivity here that this goes beyond a simple misperception. Now, as time passed, the apparition came back, and the crowds started to go there often, and it lasted for a number of years. But the main time where it was very intense, the first 3-4 months, at the point where they had crowds of estimated to 100,000 people, some people say more, to the point where the Coptic religious authorities declared it as a true miracle. There was some miraculous healing. Doctors were involved to check all this. And the Egyptian government, which was run by Muslim people, eventually agreed that there was something interesting there and that we should let it be, which is a very different reaction that we get normally from authorities when you have events that are bizarre and extraordinary like that. Usually you try to shut it down and bring ridicule to it and all this. And my hypothesis, and we can talk about this a little bit later if you want in more details, but is that because the authority were actually supportive of allowing the events to unfold, I think it actually helped, objectively speaking, to the event continues. If they're trying to shut it down, it would have shut down faster. And that's where I see sociology, parapsychology, and more normal sociology, all this mixing together and try to explain what happened.
Yeah, because you have a wonderful model whereby you describe such events, UFO sightings, and particularly your analysis of the Belgian flap, whereby you break it down into certain precise elements and sequences. And again, maybe if you could share with the listeners, watchers, I never know quite what to call the people that are tuning in, about how this develops through in terms of a lot of these phenomena. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. This is a model actually I borrowed from a German parapsychologist. His name is Walter von Lukadu, who studied intensely poltergeists or RSPK, so recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis events. And he came to the conclusion that these events, which are really local and usually in a family house, tends to unfold the same way on a regular basis. It is, the same patterns seem to show in most of those events. And so I decided to look at major, larger events and try to see if at the sociological level, at the generic level, we have the same 4 steps. So the 4 steps are first is a surprise. People don't know what's going on. Something weird happened. So that lady on the roof of the church. And that's a time where various interpretations are shared. So, is she just a lady who wants to commit suicide? Is it the Virgin Mary? So there's a lot of flux. And then we have a second phase, and sometimes it's in a few hours later, sometimes it's a few days later, it depends, where we have what we call a displacement. Essentially, a supernatural explanation takes hold, and that's what. And then some people start to really believe in a supernatural explanation that does not involve the people, as if we people have nothing to do with this. So that's why it's called displacement, because it's kind of hiding our own role and our own anxieties at the time. Because in a poltergeist event, usually the individual in the house, one of them, is the one that kind of making these things happen through psychokinesis. But because they focus on a supernatural entity, there's a displacement, and the focus on that person is pushed away. So it allows actually the events to continue, because the person is not dealing with what's going on inside of him or her, which are causing all those disturbances. So it's kind of the same story at the sociological level. There's problems and issues in the Egyptian society that were emerging at the time, but because the focus was on a supernatural event, then we didn't look at that. Then the third phase is usually when you have skeptics arriving on the scene, where they usually have very thorough look, and sometimes not fully intellectually honest look at the situation, and then they declare the situation as being faulty. They look for problems. So in the poltergeist event, it's usually either the social workers comes, or there are some scientists comes, tells them, what, this is all a hoax, there's nothing happening. And the thing is that by breaking the belief in the supernatural event, then it kind of cuts off the energy of the people producing that event. In the case of the Egyptian, because the authorities, which would be the skeptic in that case, the classic skeptics, they actually were supportive of the event. So we didn't have that decline phase. And then the last phase in a classic poltergeist is called the cover-up. So not only you have skeptics declaring it's a hoax, but now it's officially an hoax. All those people were lying. Sometimes it goes even a court case because, they value the price of a house, etc. Or at the more sociological level, if you take the example of UFOs, the government clamps down, there's nothing, you're all liars, that's it, it's over, we don't want to hear about this again. Again, in the case of the Egyptian, the authorities, no one really tried to put a cover. There was a few skeptics years after, they're trying to say, it was a geological event, which lasted for 2 years. Hard to explain, but they don't have an answer to that, but doesn't matter. Now, for them, there was other reasons. There was a collective delusion. So there is an attempt to cover and get people to forget the events, but because the authorities were on the side of the people supporting a supernatural explanation, then in that case, it didn't work out. So my question when I do those analyses at the end is that, what was the trigger? What was the deep anxiety that you would see in a family poltergeist that you could see at the social level? And in Egypt, interestingly, when those events happen, it happened just a few days after the Muslim Brotherhood people were actually released from Nasser, from jail. And among them, one of them would become later on one of the leader of Al-Qaeda. So it's as if, and I'm speculating, but it looks as if there was kind of a socially shared premonition that the government is going to do something that will have a lot of negative impact for the future of Egypt. And somehow, at the unconscious level, Egyptians knew that things were going bad, and that created that supernatural event, or I would say psychokinetic event of creating a lady on a church. So that's kind of how I explain things. It's quite different from most explanations.
That's very interesting, because when I was reading the report, I was thinking, well, of course, it was 2 years, 1968, it was 2 years after the debacle of the Six-Day War. The Egyptian, particularly the Egyptian Coptic Christian community, must have been feeling rather disassociated and displaced, being Orthodox within a major Muslim society. And also I felt that, there were various other things in the air. And I think you're quite right. It was almost as if there was a kind of a swelling up and a need for almost the symbolism to take place. And of course, the symbolism of the Virgin Mary appearing above a church seemed to have very, very powerful resonations. And clearly, you can draw parallels with Fatima. You can draw a parallel with Lourdes and the events that took place was it Mirgajura? I can never pronounce the name. Is it Croatia or Bosnia-Herzegovina? So clearly there was a standard pattern here. But what do you think is taking place in terms of the way in which the Marian hallucinations, in raised commas, take place? What do you think in terms of sociological terms? Is it some form of archetype that carries through this kind of image of the young woman? Is there something deeper here?
It's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer, because when you refer to archetype, you refer to usually to Carl Jung's key concepts. And in Jung's view, archetype was kind of hardwired in the human brain, whoever you are on the planet and whatever generation you belong to. This is an argument I find interesting, but hard to actually prove or articulate in a way that is really strong. That's why I use the word, Jung used the word collective unconscious to explain these things. I prefer the word social unconscious, so just to mark the difference with Jung, because I think the social unconscious is much more, the content of it is much more open. And so at that one specific time in the history of Egypt, to have a Marian apparition would probably have been the right symbol for the group to express itself, its anxiety at the unconscious level at that specific time. In other situations, you will have something completely different. I can give you one example, and I don't have a lot of hard data, but it's a running story that goes in Iran during the revolution. In the days before Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran to take over basically the government, there was people who claimed to see his face in the clouds. Again, how much there's of psychological normal projection in there and shared sociologically, and how much there might be something else, what it shows is that the content of the social unconscious is very flexible and depends on the culture. So some countries, for instance, you basically have no UFO events until very recently, 1990s. Why? I mean, do UFOs try to avoid a bit part of the world, or is it because that symbol doesn't mean much for those people at that time? So that's why I'm kind of more flexible in terms of. So what's the trigger? The trigger, I think, is a shared anxiety, but at the unconscious level, and that somehow in some circumstances it comes out through psi or some non-normal means.
Well, it's true, isn't it? We have this cultural tracking of the UFO phenomena through from the airships in the 1890s in the USA and in Canada, and effectively it does seem to culturally follow the things that are concerning people or collectively, or there are things that technologically people can just about understand from the future. And I know you drew the parallels with the Belgian flap to the way in which that it was coincidentally soon afterwards that the Blackbird or the Stealth or whatever it was actually used for the first time when the Americans invaded. Was it Grenada? I can't remember, or somewhere else, but Panama. So it is intriguing how the way these things, and it's a much more subtly nuanced concept. And I think You're quite right in focusing in on the sociological aspects of this, because, I mean, one of the things that fascinated me many years ago was the way in which Durkheim took suicide, being probably the most personal thing you can possibly do, and did a sociological analysis of how suicide can be defined using sociological terms such as altruistic suicide. And of course, what we're discussing here is perceptions of the collective, which can be drawn up in many ways from our understanding now of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and the idea that the wave function is somehow collapsed by the act of observation, and that somehow we create our own worldview. But because we are all observing collectively as humanity or as social groups, it's as if we're collectively collapsing the wave function to fulfill the desires of what the group wants, and in which case this could be how precognition takes place, because it's such a strong desire that people have. Now, of course, your point, which is a very, very interesting one that I'd not thought about before, and I have studied UFO phenomena across the globe in terms of different cultures, but I'd never particularly realized that, of course, the UFO phenomenon doesn't occur in certain cultures. Now, one could be cynical and say, well, it's because you don't have science fiction programs in those cultures. They haven't got used to the idea of the cylindrical object flying in the sky. But there's more to that, isn't there? For instance, the Foo Fighters that took place in the Second World War, where did they come from? And this leads me forward for you to tell us a little bit about your wonderful analysis of the 6 different not belief systems, but worldviews of what UFOs actually are. And then we can then introduce your 7th that you're bringing in. So if you can expand a little bit about the 6 different viewpoints for the people listening in and watching, because it is indeed fascinating, because I'd never thought about it before, that there are groups of researchers who are in particular belief systems, and they analyze everything from that belief system, and everything comes from that. So if you could expand a little bit, it'd be fascinating for you to do so.
All right. Just to preface, it's really about the people who write and at least express themselves vocally about the UFO phenomenon. Here I'm talking, not necessarily people who are reading that material. So just to be clear, well, there's the classic group that probably of writers is what we call usually the believer in the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And but I have one of those groups that I call the more simplistic views. It's basically alien made of flesh and blood, traveling in their spaceship made of metal and visiting the Earth. So that is a group of writers that have been there since very early days of the modern ufology story. In many ways, their story is the main narrative up to this day, although I would say a lot of people are not satisfied with it, but it remains kind of the main story. Now, there are people who actually, I call them the sophisticated extraterrestrial hypothesis, where the visitors are not really physical as we understand them, and they may not even be individual. They may be more like a kind of a foreign form of consciousness visiting us somehow. Jacques Vallée is one of them that kind of pushed this idea of some sort of influence, but external to us, and we really don't know how, when, how they can influence us. But this is another group. Much more, and then you have variations of that. So you have some ultra dimension travelers and all this, but this is essentially the idea that there's still a non-human set of consciousness or entities getting involved with us. And then, of course, you have the classic deniers, so the believers in the nil hypothesis, essentially saying, you know what, this is nothing there, this is all illusion, this is all hoaxes, and really people who believe in that, there must be something wrong with these people. That's an older version of things that was started pretty much in the early days of the modern UFO study. But I think it lost a lot of its capacity to influence because a number of cases were actually hard to crack and not that simply cannot be dismissed so easily. So on one hand, and on the second hand, you have people say, well, the witnesses that came, they were very honest, very sincere, and what you're saying is very dismissive of them. So kind of not very acceptable in this day and age. But that's kind of the number 3 group. Out of that group of the nil hypothesis, then there's the a new movement. I would say that right now they are kind of the leading opponent to the ETH, or the extraterrestrial hypothesis believers, and it's called the psychosocial hypothesis. There's three groups among them. I would say there's the early days of the psychosocial hypothesis, very much centered around the Magonia publication magazine, and essentially they try to explain these events, saying, okay, people report things, but this is all kind of sharing illusions and sharing images they have in their head about stuff they've seen in science fiction. And again, it's a little bit more nuanced than the classic debunkers, but they're still very dismissive of people because they basically claim that they know better than the actual witnesses who come forward. And anyone who has worked with witnesses and look in very details, you can see a huge amount of variety among them. And the psychosocial hypothesis as presented by these early publications in Magonia really don't cut it, because you cannot draw an inference between one specific individual, what they saw, and a magazine that's been published like 50 years earlier that who knows have read ever that magazine. So there's a lot of weaknesses there. There's then the fifth group is a more sophisticated version of it, of the social psychological hypothesis, and mostly drawn from people who have expertise in folklore. So they say, you know what, people have the right to believe whatever they want. There's nothing wrong with that. So already there's a little bit more respect for the observer, the witnesses. But they take it as a folkloric tale. So it's just a story that people tell and gets embellished over time. And essentially, people come to believe things. And when they see things in the sky, they just relate that observation to what they know, which is the tale that they were told. Again, it's a little bit better. But the problem is that, again, we still have this fundamental problem that you have individual observations where people and multiple witnesses would have very detailed descriptions that do not match at all the folkloric tale of UFOs. I mean, if you look at the details of accounts, the gray aliens, this is actually a minority of reports. The vast amount of variations of size, of shapes, of types of attitude and behavior you have by those alleged aliens is scattering. It's essentially the folkloric explanation does not hold too well, unless you do generalize very fast and go over a lot of details because they're kind of annoying details. So now we have the last version of it by a good friend of mine, actually, David Halperin, who I think represent probably the most advanced and the most respectful version of the psychosocial hypothesis, where they're strongly influenced by psychoanalysis, saying, you know what people see is something that's coming from inside of them. And they might be influenced by social events, they might be influenced by social images carried through TV and internet and so on and so forth. But there's something inside a person that we need to know about that brought them to see or project that image or that perception to the outside world. And although the people really believe they saw something, and they in their own consciousness they actually saw something, but there was nothing objective to it. So it's more respectful because in the sense that it forced the researcher to look at every individual involved and each cases, try to understand the witness for who he is or she is, her own personal history and so on. So that's I would say a much more healthy, much more ethical way of looking at the phenomenon. But it still shares the one problem is that David would say that there's nothing parapsychological happening, there's nothing odd, out of an explanation that's happening. All of this is coming from inside a person, but we have to look at that person. So my seventh group, right, at least myself and maybe a few other people, were saying, you know what, there are many cases where indeed it was a hoax or it was a misperception. So I integrate that part, but not all cases are like that. So I kind of integrate that. I integrate a little bit of the ETH views in the sense that I accept there might be some situation where you have objectively something in the sky. That something is not necessarily something, an object from another planet, but there's something there that could be some sort of very exotic natural phenomenon, but that phenomenon has an impact on us. So it could be balls of light, for instance, that they are highly electromagnetified and may have an impact on us. And we may actually interact with these things as a two-way street. I integrate some of their views in there. And I also integrate some of the psychosocial views in the sense that, indeed, if we share perception, we share cultures, we share language, and therefore it has to have an impact on how we describe events, how we feel about events, how we interpret things that are strange. So I combine all this together to say, you know what, how about there might be actually something really weird in the sky. It is partially influenced by society, by our own individual psychology, and then sometimes it can be, yes, just a misperception, and other times it is something really odd. And maybe parapsychology can help us to understand what is that thing. So that's in a nutshell the 7 ways of looking at UFOs.
I think that's a very refreshing approach as well, and very, very important, because clearly there is something taking place. There is no question. And I mean, the people I know that are involved in ufology and the people who have witnessed things, they are the kind of people I genuinely believe that there was something that they experienced, whether it was external to themselves, whether it was internal to themselves, is somewhat unclear. And my argument always is to turn around and just say, okay, it was an hallucination, explains nothing, because you then have to explain the hallucination, and you have to explain the genesis of that hallucination and why this particular person at this particular moment in time saw whatever it was they saw in the sky. And indeed, when we discuss hallucinations, when you start asking questions to exactly what hallucinations are, and you speak to neurologists and neurochemists and psychologists, we then have a problem because they don't quite know what hallucinations are, and particularly if the individual was not looking at the time for a UFO or an object in the sky and suddenly they see it, or they see an alien, or taking it back to the folklore arguments, they see a pixie, they see a goblin, and they associate that with the UFO in some way or form. And I think it's profoundly important that we look at this subject in a far more objective way, because it is a real phenomenon in the sense that we define real. I mean, how do we define what is real? I mean, for instance, one of the cases that you cited, which I'd like you to expand upon, was the case where you said there was a UFO or something seen by 2 different individuals in cars, and it was effectively the same object in the same location, but other people did not see it. So what is taking place there? What links those 2 people? And indeed, you have other cases like that where individuals have seemingly seen something, but other people haven't.
Yeah, the case you're referring to is there was 2 different cars at the stoplight in Canada, in a large city, and so both people reported seeing a UFO or an object. It was not very far, maybe 1 kilometer away, but enough to be able to see it. But it was a very busy intersection, and no one else reported it. So it's kind of interesting because it seems objective. At least 2 groups of people saw it, so there's a degree of objectivity. But nothing seems physical to it. So I was not able to pursue it further in terms of finding if these 2 groups of people have something in common. But I have another example, and interestingly from the same city in Canada, where you have 2 individuals who saw a UFO. And this one I'll explain a little bit. There was actually a man and a woman living together, married. It was in the evening. And it was not that long ago, about 10, 15 years ago. And they live on the edge of a valley. So in the valley, there is thousands of houses. It's a large city out there. And eventually they come to look at the window, and they saw what we would call a UFO, but a huge thing with all kinds of lights coming and shading from all kinds of directions. And there was part of the sky that you could not see the stars, so somehow it was hiding what was behind. Now the question is, and the 2 saw it. I mean, it was not a case of folie à deux, where one kind of tried to convince the other one that there's something, but it's very fuzzy. No, it was in your face. You can't miss it. It was absolutely ostentatious. Yet there's thousands of people in the valley. Someone would have seen something. Someone would have reported it. Absolutely nothing. So that's an interesting case because you have 2 individuals who actually do see something clearly. So there's a degree of objectivity, but the thousands of people in the valley saw nothing. Now, I was able to investigate a little bit that story, and I can link it to parasociology in a, I would say, interesting way. If we think about UFOs and that story, because it was relatively recent, we think about UFO, a lot of people think about conspiracy theory. So a UFO, in a way, represents by default, almost because of a popular culture, something hidden that should be exposed, right? There's a big movement about asking governments to declare all the things they know about UFO, as if they actually do know a lot. But so somehow the UFO as a symbol seems to carry the meaning of something that needs to be declared, something that needs to be exposed. Interestingly, that couple, the husband actually was cheating on her. And for years, actually, even before they were married, when they were just boyfriend and girlfriend. And somehow I think she might have some feelings that something was not quite right. And he obviously had a lot on his conscience. So a parasociological explanation would be that the conditions were right for a need for this information, so the affair, to get exposed. And what more great than a UFO as a symbol from both their unconscious to say, you know what, this needs to be exposed, to be made public among themselves, among the 2 of them. And interestingly, the only one concerned with this affair was those 2. So they are the only one who saw the UFO. And so in that sense, it fits an explanation that combines both psychology, in the sense of doing 2 individuals are involved in the same issue, but also a sociological aspect to it, where you have a symbol that is used to help their own unconscious challenges to get expressed, and then there's a somewhat objective manifestation as both of them saw the thing in the sky. So that's another example of a more parasociological explanation of the UFO phenomenon.
That's fascinating, because, for instance, if you think about it, that the object in the sky had obscured the stars behind. So what we have here effectively are 2 different types of hallucination. We're having the hallucination of the object, but we've also got the hallucination of exclusion, because effectively the object is occluding the stars behind. So there are two kinds of hallucination taking place, which are being shared by two individuals, but not being seen by anybody else. And this comes back, doesn't it, to the idea of how the brain processes external reality, in the sense that we know from perception studies that everything that we believe to be external to ourselves is actually internally modeled by the brain to create an internal facsimile of what the external world could be. And we know that there's a term for people who think there's a one-to-one relationship between what the brain presents to consciousness, whatever in the final analysis consciousness is within the brain, and indeed who the observer is in the brain. The little homunculus that is sitting there is somehow perceiving everything outside. Is that it's not a one-to-one relationship. External reality is not as it seems. It is something that the brain creates for us. So in which case there's absolutely no reason why the brain couldn't project into that external hallucinatory reality that we call consensual reality, something that is deeply rooted either within that person's psychology or is deeply rooted within some form of collective unconscious or collective consciousness. So in which case, going back to Jung's idea of, the famous book he wrote on UFOs, what is it, myth of things that are seen in the sky, we're suddenly coming into a far deeper analysis of the relationship between the observer and the observed, which of course, if we go down to particle physics, we have the idea that, as I say, the wave function is collapsed, the idea that Max Born came up with, and the idea that in some way there is a very, very close relationship between what we perceive and what is out there. We're suddenly moving into those areas now where we're moving away. I think it was something you said in either in your book or one of your articles, that we're now moving away from the scientism of the 1950s into a far more holistic viewpoint of the mind relationship. And it's not dualism. We're not actually saying that there is mind and matter. It's something far more complex, that at a deeper level of reality, there is something deeper that we all perceive. Now, you've been involved in ufology and everything else for an awful long time. Are there any cases that you think really stand out for you in terms of they were seminal in your own understanding of how it all works? You must have some examples that I'm sure that you thought at the time, that really was quite inexplicable, and it's something I can't explain. Because, of course, the central question is, are UFOs physically out there? Because, as you rightly say, there is evidence that, that if a UFO comes down, there might be evidence of burnt patches or indentations in the ground, or people have some kind of effect whereby they are burned by the UFO or something like that. So are there any cases that you think really sort of highlight exactly this kind of viewpoint?
Well, there's one case in particular that left a strong impression on me, because I had a chance to discuss with the experiencer, one of the two. It was during the Belgian UFO wave, and there was two young men at the time. They were in their early 20s, and they're driving on a road at night, and they saw in a field, I would say about 500 meters away from the road, a huge triangular object that was kind of maybe again about 250 meters above the ground, and moving very slowly, and that object was described as being as large as the Concorde airplane. So if it gives you an idea of the size, it's quite significant. So they decided to stop on the side of the road and have a good look. And now we're talking about several minutes of observation. We're not talking something you saw in the corner of your eyes that you cannot interpret properly. And eventually that object actually came over their head, and they couldn't believe it. And eventually, and fairly close, maybe 100 meters above their head. And it was noiseless, but one of the witnesses told me that there's a feeling of power in that thing. Like That's all you could describe. Is this? He felt that whatever it was very, very powerful, and eventually it left. And those two individuals, this event marked their life ever since. One of them became very much interested in parapsychology and the paranormal phenomena in general, ufology, and he has no explanation. That's another thing to keep in mind. Is most witnesses, they may think it's a UFO from another planet. Some of them do, but most of them, they're not sure what it is, and they're really not taking a definitive take on what it is. So that's what a lot of the debunkers miss, is that most witnesses actually are not even sure what they saw. And they're very sincere and honest. That, I have no interpretation because I don't know. I saw something really weird. They describe it in detail, but they don't know what it is. And so that was one case I found fascinating, because the witness also described the object having big bolts, and he gave the expression of as if it was those ships of the early 20th century, like the Titanic. They were bolted that way, which doesn't make any sense if you think about the spaceship. So there's a lot of elements in that story that you can connect to the larger world, feeling of power, completely strange technology that would make no sense, and two people very level-headed, had a very good look, several minutes of observation, very close, and no explanation for that. Now in Belgium, the skeptics are actually very virulent, and some of them are completely dishonest intellectually. It's actually breathtaking how dishonest they are. So it's a good case that shows how one event is unexplainable, and yet you have people who try to, put it down. So it's one of those cases that have all the ingredients that I'm talking about. I found it very fascinating.
Well, this is the thing that frustrates me, is that my research background, and I've now written 8-9 books, and my fascination is altered states of consciousness, the out-of-body experience, the near-death experience, and moving then into perceptions of aliens in one way or another. I'm quite fascinated by things like Charles Bonnet syndrome, where people see little figures walking around. And in my latest book, Opening Doors of Perception, I make links between Charles Bonnet syndrome and people who have migraine, people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, who seem to be perceiving something. There's kind of a breakthrough from somewhere else almost. You can use the argument of breakthrough from Magonia, I suppose. And the thing I find amazing from the people I have interviewed and talked to over the years is their total honesty. They, as you rightly say, they have perceived something, or they have experienced something that is completely inexplicable. And sometimes the things they describe are so utterly ridiculous that they couldn't possibly make them up. If they wanted to make something up, they would make it far more exciting or far more acceptable to the skeptics, but they don't. They turn around and they say, I saw a little green man that had little boots on that were curled up, and things like this. So clearly these things are something that are deeply rooted within ourselves. And I was wondering, one of the areas that I know that you touch upon, and I touch upon in my own writing, is the idea that in some way the work done by Michael Persinger in Sudbury at the Laurentian University, the idea that in some way either ultrasound or electromagnetic energy or stimulation of the temporoparietal fissure in the brain or the temporal lobes can somehow create somebody having hallucinations. DMT can do something similar, but they're missing the point. And the point is that these things happen, and the argument is, from my point of view, is that these things that are the explanations are in fact the facilitators. You're not explaining it by turning around and saying, just because somebody takes DMT and they see the machine elves, you need to explain why they've seen the machine elves in the first place and what is taking place here. Because in the final analysis, all it is chemicals reacting in the brain or something taking place in the temporal lobes which stimulate these experiences. But there's no explanation as to why they see them. So where are you taking we're now coming towards the end of our hour together, and it's been utterly fascinating, and I think we've only scratched the surface. So where are you going to be taking, because as I said earlier on before we started, that your whole idea of applying sociology to parapsychology is very, very exciting, and I think a very refreshing movement forward. So what's your intentions now? You've got the book and everything else, so where are you moving forward to now? What are the next things that you're going to be doing in this area?
Well, what I'm focusing on is actually the role of information, but let me explain what I mean by that. In hallucinations, yes, the brain can create them, and personal psychology can be behind it, and sociological elements, culture, images from television, etc., can feed into it. But what is really interesting is that in those so-called hallucination, there's oftentimes interesting information. So the case I explained of the couple, there's information that was, of course, hidden into symbolism, but information about, there's an affair going on. That was the message. There's information to it. A classic example that was studied actually over 100 years ago in the famous book, The Phantasm of the Living. People have probably hallucination of people coming, who's dead or dying, and they see that person. It's an hallucination. The person was not in the room, but they got information about the state of that person. Another example of that is people hearing a knock on the door. They open the door, there's nobody there. Then 5 minutes later, somebody arrives, knock on the door, and there's someone there. The first time, yes, it was an hallucination. If you had a tape recorder, probably no sound would have been made. But that hallucination had information of an upcoming event. And so my focus is really try to see how we can extract or interpret information out there in those events that are unexplainable. Because I think that's really what is extraordinary, is that those events, irrespective of how they are actually physically produced or psychologically produced, they tend to carry information that are either precognitive or may have some psychokinetic kinetic elements to it. But that's the special information that is contained in those events that just really make it extraordinary. Not so much the mechanism that should actually produce them. So that's my focus for the upcoming research.
That's very interesting and much needed, I think. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, that how can people gain information when it's information that they won't necessarily be aware of in one way or another. And I know that we had a recent guest, or comparatively recent guest on the show, Diane Hennessy-Powell, and I'm not sure if you're aware of her work, but she is working with autistic children who are precognitive. And these children, there is no question, there is no doubt, these children are precognitive. The question is, and they are telepathic, and the question is how they are telepathic. Is there a collective unconscious, a collective consciousness that we can attune into that is greater than the brain? Is there a field of consciousness out there that we can attune into in one way or another? And we are all moving forward in very similar ways, and I'm very keen to stay in contact with you because your work very much interests me, and it's something that I'll be taking my work forward, and I will be talking to you because my next book I will be discussing aspects of your work, and I'm very, very keen to talk to you on an informal basis about how we could possibly work together on bringing some developments, because I'm a huge fan of Jacques Vallée, John Keel, and various other individuals, but I think there is more to it, and I think you're one of the guys that is actually looking at the more to it, the more, it's not rational is the wrong term, but more analytical, applying what we are as trained sociologists to apply to the things we see. So Eric, thank you very much for spending an hour with us here. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm very apologetic about the Archon problems we had at the start, but we did succeed in the end, and I think obviously fate was making to ensure that we did actually get through and have this conversation. So how can people contact you? Your website, your blog site, you can give us the link for
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Anthony, to having me on your show, and it was a pleasure to talk to a fellow sociologist. Yes, I can. My blog is Parapsychology in one word. If you type it in any search engine, you will get to me. And there's a place where you can leave a message if you want to contact me, and I usually respond pretty quick. So that's the easiest way to reach me.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. And as usual, thanks to Dia Nunez in the background, who without this it wouldn't work. And Dia and I went through quite a kind of stressful period. I'm sure Eric went through quite a stressful period as well, where we were trying to make this show actually work. But thanks again, and thanks for listening in. And we'll look forward to seeing you again all in a month's time when we'll be recording another edition of Consciousness Hour. Thank you, and thanks, Eric, as well.
Thank you.